So as you maybe remember, or maybe not, if you haven't been here the last couple weeks, we've been reading through this letter of Hebrews. And it's a letter, a sermon that was written for a community that had started with a whole lot of energy and then had kind of gotten into a slump. People had kind of gotten complacent. They had lost their energy for their work in sharing God's gospel. And so this sermon is meant to re-inspire that community. And we've kind of gone back to the basics, learning about who Christ is for us, how God has done all of the work. And now we're getting a little bit fuller picture of what this writer means by calling Jesus the great high priest. Since we have a great high priest, Jesus, the Son of God, who has passed through the heavens from death into new life with God, let us hold tightly to our faith. For Jesus is not some high priest who has no sympathy for our weakness and flaws. He has already been tested in every way that we are tested, but he emerged victorious without failing God. So let us step boldly to the throne of grace, where we can find mercy and grace to help when we need it most. Remember what I said earlier about the role of the high priest, even the ones chosen by human beings. The job of every high priest is reconciliation, approaching God on behalf of others and offering him gifts and sacrifices to repair the damage caused by our sins against God and against each other. The high priest should have compassion for those who are ignorant of the faith and those who fall out of the faith, because he has also wrestled with human weakness. And so the priest must offer sacrifices both for his sins and for those of the people. The office of high priest and the honor that goes along with it isn't one that someone just takes. One must be set aside, called by God, just as God called Aaron, the brother of Moses. In the same way, the Anointed One, our liberating King, didn't call himself, but was appointed to his priestly office by God, who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father," and who also says elsewhere, "You are a priest forever in the honored order of Melchizedek." When Jesus was on earth, a man of flesh and blood, he offered up prayers and pleas, groans and tears to the one who could save him from death. He was heard because he approached God with reverence. Although he was a son, Jesus learned obedience through the things he suffered. And once he was perfected through that suffering, he became the way of eternal salvation for all those who hear and follow him. For God appointed him to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. This is the word of the Lord. So this great high priest, why are we talking about this great high priest? This congregation that has kind of become a little blah. They're not as into things as they used to be. They go to worship every once in a while. Maybe they help out when there's a service activity, but only if it fits in their schedule. They're kind of losing the zest of what it means to be church. So why talk about this? Why talk about this Jesus as the great high priest? Well, the writer lays out what it means to be a good high priest from a human perspective. It says, well, first, the job of a great high priest is to restore relationships, reconciliation, and particularly to help restore the relationship between God and humanity, to bridge that gap that is so easy for us to create. And then the second job of a priest is to know the suffering of the people. That as a high priest, you're a human too, and you've been through some tough times, you've had your doubts, you've had your concerns, and so when you come before God on behalf of others, you know the pain and suffering of your people, because you've been there with them, because you've seen them hurt and you have hurt yourself. And And the third thing is that you don't choose it for yourself. To be a great high priest, you have to get a calling from God. You didn't just take it for honor and glory, but it was given to you by your people, by your community, by God. That's what it means to be high priest. And so to that, he says, all right, let's take a look at Jesus. He was ordained not by himself. He did not choose it, but rather he was given that honor by God. So, okay, we check that one off. He's a good high priest. And then we take a second look, say the second part was a good and great high priest needs to know the suffering of his people. And he says, Jesus did that. Jesus was God, but Jesus also became flesh and blood. Jesus had friends, and those friends betrayed him. Jesus felt the real pain and suffering of what it meant to be beaten, of what it meant to be left alone, of what it meant to be cast out, of what it meant to lose friends when he needed them most. He felt the depth of our pain and suffering so much that when Jesus was on a cross, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That Jesus felt what it was like to feel distant from God. Even Jesus felt that, so that makes him a great and good high priest because he knows our suffering. And that third piece, that then a great high priest is the one who builds and restores relationships between God and us and between one another. And that is the job that Jesus came to do once and for all. To say that because of the suffering that Jesus had, God said, no more offerings do you need to bring. You don't need to do anything ever anymore to make the relationship right between yourself and God. Jesus did it all here on the cross. That pain and suffering that Jesus endured is all the offering that God needed. And so as far as doing the work of reconciling, of making the relationship right between God and us, Jesus did it. It's done. You don't have to work at that anymore. And so he says Jesus is the great high priest so that you don't have to worry anymore. You don't have to worry about making your relationship right with God. It's been done. And this God knows your pain, knows your suffering. And this God has appointed Jesus to be that great high priest, not just for a lifetime, but forever. Forever. Jesus serves as that great high priest. And what does this mean for us then? Okay, again, why? Why talk about this? Well, Martin Luther talked about what it meant to be a priesthood of all believers. That each and every single one of us, because of Jesus, the great high priest, have that same access to God now. That in these waters, we all become a chosen people to do God's work and participate in that mission of reconciliation, of healing the bonds that have been broken, healing the bonds that have been severed. And all of us have been given particular gifts to do that. Particular gifts to do that. That it's not all about the person who preaches and teaches up front. That's not the only way to be priest. That's not the only way to participate in reconciliation, but it also, and Luther goes through a really long list, everything from the people who make shoes in your local town, to the government and the people who keep your people safe, to the home and the people who cook and take care of children. All of those things are a priestly calling. Working to continually work at making that relationship between God and humanity right again, and the relationship between all of us right again. All of us get called into that priestlyhood, and we get given special gifts. That's what Luther calls vocation then. That we all have a calling, a vocation, certain gifts and talents given to you that you use for the sake of others. And that's what it means to be a part of church. That you say yes to use whatever gifts God has given you for the sake of others. And as you do that, you make God's kingdom a reality. You participate in healing the relationships that have been torn apart. So whatever it is that you do, whether you're a teacher, whether you're an electrician or a carpenter, whether you worked at a plant making vehicles, you were doing God's work as you are doing those things. If you're at home taking care of children, taking care of grandchildren, taking care of your spouse, cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, you're doing God's work. You're doing God's work because that's the gift and talent God gave you, and you're helping for people to feel safe, to feel comfortable, to feel loved. And when people feel safe and comfortable and loved, then they're willing to be out and open-hearted towards the rest of the world, and we can keep on going. We can share God's love with a world that so desperately needs it. So look into your own life. Look into your own life and see, how am I participating in God's mission of reconciliation? What gifts do I have to share? How do I share the love of God in my everyday life? Whether it's at home, whether it's in your community, maybe it's in government, how do you use the particular gifts and abilities that you have? Maybe the gift that you have now is time. You have extra time. Maybe you're not working, maybe you're retired, and you have some extra time, and you think, okay, this is the gift God gives me. How can I use that time for the sake of others, not just for myself? How can I make sure that I'm sharing the love of God with somebody else, not just myself? Or maybe you have some special gifts. Maybe you're an electrician like Bob, and he helped to do a lot of the work of changing this church over to having LED lights. And that's sharing God's love with the world, right? That's caring for creation, that's caring for this church, using your gifts and abilities for the sake of others. It's the people who serve on council. They have a little bit of extra time, they have some knowledge, they have some leadership skills, and so they give of themselves for the sake of the church, for the sake of leadership. We have people working on all kinds of committees. We have ladies who work in the church. We have people who go out into the community and do service, who work with nonprofits. We have people who do so much work in the world. All of that is your calling, to be a part of God's work in the world. So look into your heart. Think about how you're participating. How are you doing your part at saying yes to God's calling, to share God's love with a world that needs it? Amen.